What is up, everybody? We're here for another episode, the long-awaited on-program book club. We've been trying to get this one done for a minute now. Inquisitor, Rise of the Red Blade, full book review, discussion. Got a whole gang of folks here with us today. Left to right, Andy Mason.
Hello.
Heck yeah, and Hannah B. And Michael B. Everybody's here. We're nailing these intros, man. We're just like flawless execution. I'm gonna iron out one of these days. Do we say hello? Do we wave? What do we do? We got to figure that out. But that's for another day. Today we are talking about this book right here. Ooh, Rise of the Red Blade. This was sick. It was a lot of fun. It's gonna be eventually we're gonna get into spoilers, but we're gonna start out spoiler-free, general discussion. I want to get everybody's opinions, high level, of course, and then we'll dive into some of the characters, some of the plot details, and then just if there was any controversy that we could find, and then we can dive into that and spend as much time as we need because we've got nowhere to be except sleep because we're tired. So, all right, let's dive in. I'm going to start with Andy, and I want to get Andy's opinion, high level, of this book, spoiler free. What the heck did you think?
I really loved this book. I have a lot of spoilery notes. My overall let me look at overall it's like an 8 or a 9 out of 10. I really loved reading it. It was, I feel like, more heavy than some of the other Star Wars books that I've read, at least emotionally. But I still really enjoyed it, really loved it, and I've kind of been thinking about rereading it, honestly.
Yeah, it got pretty dark. It was fun. It was very reminiscent to me of some of the Darth Bane, like kind of Old Republic stuff. So I liked that. Hannah, what about you? You're hot off the presses. You just finished it, skating under the grate. So what do you think?
Finished the last page like 20 minutes ago. In terms of the way that the book was written and the way the story progressed, I'd probably give it a solid 7, but I wouldn't say that I enjoyed the book. But I also don't know if that was the author's intention, because the book was so dark. I feel for myself it's hard to say that I could enjoy it because it was dark. And I don't want to get into spoilers, but I have some questions about some of the things that happened and the way her character progressed and who she became that I am excited to get into because, yes, I will say no more because I have no spoilers.
Michael, on to you.
I think I'm gonna straddle the fence here. When I first started reading it, I kind of hated the book. I'm trying to avoid spoilers. I did not enjoy it. I was like, this is slow. It's grueling. We're spending so much time in this character's head, just processing everything that's going on. Just kind of the way that it was written, the style was really grating on me at first. But I got used to it. And I think they did it a little bit less and less as the story went on. And there's some interesting ways in which the book is written to where at first I was like, oh, I hate this and I hate what they're trying to do and how they're trying to portray the Jedi that we know and love and sort of the council and everything. And for obviously spoilery reasons, I think those things that I was afraid of or didn't like at the beginning didn't pan out in the same way I was expecting. And so as the book went on, I enjoyed it a little bit more. So it's funny though, because Hannah said she wasn't sure she enjoyed the book, but she still rated it a 7. I don't even know if I would rate it that highly, to be honest. I didn't hate it. I didn't love it either. I kind of went away from like, it was a bit of a roller coaster, but I'm kind of meh on it. Like I probably give it an average 5. I've read better books. I've read worse books. It's been a while now since I've listened to it, so maybe after this discussion, I'll kind of remember things that I really enjoyed about it. But several months later, having read other Star Wars books in the meantime, before and after, I'm kind of like, I could take it or leave it. I don't really care. It's kind of irrelevant for me, but
it's gonna be for me, dog. Nice. Thanks. All right. So as far as I'm concerned, my spoiler free is this one hit a lot of my my sort of desires for a book. It got semi-philosophical. You had the sort of point of view character, unreliable narrator type deal going on. You had to decide whether or not you believed what the character was saying of the situation. You had different points of view, and none of that is spoilers. I don't think. It's just like different people looking at the same event, and it's events that we've seen in canon. So you got different perspectives on those same events. It had some lore implications, not as much as you might think. It spent a lot of time on the Jedi and less on the Inquisitorius, which is an interesting thing from the marketing perspective. But all in all, I did enjoy it. I like Delilah Dawson's work. I've been a pretty big fan of all of her novels so far, and the Lethal Weapon. I think it was Lethal Weapon, whatever the short story she wrote for the Force Awakens books, the little short story there, The Perfect Weapon, that's what it was. Lethal Weapon. Anyway, yeah, so it was good. I would rate it 7.5, 8 out of 10, and that's more on my enjoyment scale. It hit a lot of the things that I enjoy, again, keying back to sort of the Darth Bane, sort of dark side Old Republic novels, where those got a little darker and spent time in the mind of somebody that is predisposed to thinking dark side things. And of course, anything involving the Clone Wars is going to be graded on a curve for old Eddie G. So yeah, that was a lot of fun. Okay, spoiler time. So, I mean, come on, who's watching this? It's been months, you know what I mean? Like, we know. But anyway, let's dive in. You've had your warning. Starting from the top, let's go around the table and just say what we thought of this. I'll give a brief synopsis of the plot. It'll be super high level, and if you guys think of anything that I've skimmed over, by all means, throw it out. But basically, you've got Iskat Akaris, who's a Jedi Padawan, and she's learning how to be a Jedi. And almost immediately, she's thrust into the Clone Wars. She has a tenuous relationship with her master. We see a lot of that before Geonosis. She's kind of being forced to be someone she doesn't feel like she's meant to be. And then Geonosis happens, and her master dies, and she's thrust furthermore into this conflict, and she's actually knighted at that point. So she becomes one of these sort of Nadar Veb, Anakin Skywalker, early onset Jedi knighthood, and is thrust into that responsibility with her friend Tualon and some other Jedi from her sort of class. And it goes through the Clone Wars, and you see her forced to become a kind of a child soldier, and all the while she is struggling with her place in this and who she wants to be. She feels the Jedi are holding her back, which is a theme that we've seen before. She has a tendency to rush to what we all know as the dark side, but she wasn't quite ready to ascribe that label to it at the time. She didn't feel the Jedi were letting her show her true talents, as it were. And then the Clone Wars progress and things get darker. She has to make a few morally ambiguous choices, and she makes them without the ambiguity. She just knee-jerk pulls the trigger, and that ruffles a few people's feathers, and so she gets even more she gets sidelined for most of the war and is stuck at Coruscant, where she meets this old cat named Hizo. Cat only slightly pun intended. He's a Salonian, and they are very feline. So that individual comes off as her friend, and kind of helps her understand her place in the Force, it would appear. And then she gets sent out into the field, and she goes out in the field on a mission with Tualon, and all the Jedi on her mission die except for her and Tualon, and then the clone troopers turn on her, and Order 66 happens. She's spared, Tualon is not. She becomes an Inquisitor, and then come to find out later on, Tualon survived in the same way as so many other Sith have, with hatred fueling them to do unnatural things, which we have seen many a time in canon. And then, of course, it dovetails in nicely with the events of the Darth Vader comic, where she ends up meeting her demise, but we do get to spend a little bit of time with her as an Inquisitor. That is my high-level summary. I don't know if anybody has any key points that I left off that they want to throw in there, but do that while you give me your spoiler thoughts. And again, I'll keep the same order, starting with you, Andy Mason.
Why do we have to start with me?
Okay, fine. Withdrawn. Starting with you, Michael B.
I know
No!
Michael will have thoughts, and it will spur, like, for me to respond with thoughts.
Go, Michael,
Goodness.
go.
So when the book first started, like I said, I wasn't loving how much time we spent in Iskat's head. I was kind of like, wow, the story is not moving at all. We've just spent like multiple pages of text, and I'm listening to this like multiple pages with her processing this one little thing, and my goodness, I'm like, wow, is this what it's like to be my wife? I don't know. I can't do this anymore. I'm just saying, like, as an animal.
Yes, actually, I can confirm.
But
you should read the book
anyway,
again,
so
Michael.
Andy and I don't know what to do here, but we're glad you guys are having fun.
It's hilarious.
We have a healthier
Anyway.
relationship than Iskat and Dwellon, so you can see we're good here.
Way to clear the bar, guys.
I was starting off kind of bored and kind of not enjoying and really worried that the way the author was sort of writing this character was a critique of the Jedi, trying to show like, oh, the good guys, kind of like muddy the waters here. Like, oh, we have the good guys, we have the bad guys. Star Wars is typically, or at least traditionally, very black and white in terms of these are the good guys, these are the bad guys, like sometimes literally. The original movies and things have been very black and white. Even the way like we have the rebels, and the rebels are terrorists in some light and vision, but like at the same time, that's not really how they were portrayed. Even if Lucas himself was kind of like, the original inspiration was like, oh, Vietnam, and wait a minute, the rebels are the bad guys for us, kind of thing. Like, it's very interesting where that comes from. Anyway, point being, the story itself was boiled down.
Don't just repackage my counter argument like it's not valid, okay? Just because you say it quickly doesn't mean it's invalid.
Anyway, what I didn't like was we have seen, I feel like the Jedi have taken so much heat, especially prequel series Jedi, that we never get to see them just being awesome. Like, we have the High Republic, but honestly, the High Republic has been full of them being absolute failures too. So that's not always a great thing. We have some great shining beacons in there, but like as a whole, the Council and the Jedi not been doing great. So I was like immediately done with the story. But then as soon as I started picking up on the fact that, okay, her critiques of her master are not just unreasonable, not just like unfair, but like this is a theme. The way that she's sort of describing what her master is doing, and she's presupposing and putting her own interpretation on something that I'm thinking as the reader, like, wait a minute, why does it have to mean that? Or why does it have to be taken that way? Or couldn't she mean something else? Why don't you just ask her? Why don't you just ask your master or say this thing to her? Why are you processing all this internally? Ask the question, again, being frustrated. And after I started realizing, oh, this is one of those books where the narration is done semi first person, and everything that we're about to read and everything that's happening in this book is sort of colored by her interpretation of the events. When I got to that point, I started realizing, okay, maybe I'll give this a longer shot, and maybe the plot will pick up. And of course the plot does pick up when it's, she's like in ecstasy over killing 30 Geonosians, and she's confused why the Jedi are terrified of her and like, you need help. And she's like, what do you mean I need help? This is who I am. I'm a weapon. You have to use me. And they're like, no, girl, you need to sit on a bench. Like, please be a librarian. Please go collect Force artifacts. This is not good for you. This is not good for the galaxy. So I don't know. I think it was a very interesting point. And then fast forward all the way through to when her master's master, I can't remember the guy's name, that she had to fight on that Sith planet. And you get a lot more of the information on what the Jedi did actually know about her and the signs they saw and how they tried. And no, they weren't perfect. He sort of was still deluded into thinking what he did was perfect. But me as the reader going like, no, it was kind of like a worse of, there's a bunch of really bad options, but what do you do? I feel like they got to the point where it wasn't just like, oh, look, the Jedi are terrible. They don't know how to handle people who are different. And they didn't even see any of this stuff, because that's her impression, is they don't even see her as being different. They don't see all this stuff going on. They're like, no, dude, you were walking around with a basically visible cloud over your head your entire life, and we didn't know what to do with you. Anyway, all that to say, those are my thoughts about at least the first initial part of the book. And I'll let it go now.
So
There's a lot.
so this is gonna be fun. That like the cool thing about this book is I was trying to think of like how we can talk about the events and the sort of plot details and kind of knock that out, because I knew that was gonna be the shining diamond of what we're gonna actually discuss here, which is, does this who's at fault for the way this all works, right? And the way this all goes down. And I have a lot of thoughts, but I don't want to do that thing where it's ping pong back with me every single time. So I'm going to let other people talk first, and I'm going to kick it over to Hannah. See what you have to say about what Michael just said, if you want to add to or subtract from.
So I mostly agree with Michael. I think that if we're just when I first approached the book stylistically, I definitely also, the first quarter of the book, I had to like really get myself through it because it was so much in her head. But at the same time, to Michael's joke earlier, I was like, I'm in my head a lot too. And I think about this, but it was small learning point on the side for me. I was like, there's some danger when you're isolated and in your head a lot. And that's something we can probably take away from that. And she was in her head a lot and was pretty convinced that she was right all the time. Another learning point that we can take as humans.
Certainly.
So that was a little hard to get through. And then as I got through, part 1, part 2, part 3, and just saw her development, it was an interesting progression. I think it made sense. Not saying it's right, the choices that she made, but I think it made sense, and you did absolutely get to see her, well, it's not growth, I guess it's decline in a sense through this book, and all the events that happened and how she just got deeper and deeper into her own head and let the people around her influence her one way or another. So that was interesting to watch her character progress. I guess progress is the best way to say it in that manner. The callbacks to the movies, I haven't read many other books, but the shows and the movies that were there were really interesting. There was some facts in there that I didn't realize. I was talking to Michael about this before, and I'd said, I didn't realize, and he had said, I don't think it was fully spelled out in canon before, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I didn't realize how many Jedi had died on Geonosis. I thought that was really interesting. I didn't realize how depleted their numbers were. And so I think, too, from a perspective besides just hers, it was a really interesting way for me to visualize the war that was going on from the perspective of a standard Jedi fighting in it, right? Not the Anakin Skywalker, not the Obi-Wan, kind of like what happened with the Battlefront book that we've gone through, where you get to see the war from the perspective of your everyday soldier who's just on the ground.
Right.
So that was really interesting, I think. And that was some interesting tidbits that kind of fed in with just everything going on with her. And then you got to experience the Inquisitors, for me, outside of the shows, because that's really the only other place that I've experienced them and get to see what that training was like, and really the contrast between the Inquisitors and the Jedi Temple and everything, that just how different their lifestyles were. And really watch as I don't think she ever fully, maybe a little bit towards the end, but really watched as she got to experience what she thought true freedom was, and how I think it really wasn't what she thought it was. And I don't think she fully realized that until the very weird ending, which we can talk about later. But those are my thoughts for now.
Certainly. Yeah. No. Interesting stuff. Yeah, no, I agree with you about the perspective of the boots on the ground. Very, very fun. And that's why we read a lot of these books, to be honest with you, getting those different perspectives on these sort of massive canon events from the movies. That's the lion's share of why we're here. So yeah, it did that very, very well. Is that enough material, Andy? I'd love to get your perspective at this point.
Yes. It's hard because I unfortunately did not just finish this book. I finished this book like 2 or 3 months ago. So I'm looking
I'm
at
gonna
my
hold that
notes.
L. That's on me. That's on me, guys. Yep.
My notes, I mean, I write them down as I'm reading the book, so they're very specific to like, oh, at chapter 29 I liked this part. So it's hard for me to sit here and think of like my broad strokes thoughts, but I actually agree with a lot of what everybody has said. I might be the most sympathetic to Iskat, guilty, perhaps. I look at moments in her life and specifically her experiences at the Jedi Temple, and I am just so heavily sympathetic towards her. I know we brought up Hizo, we mentioned Hizo, and I think that was kind of like an oh shit moment for me in the book when she's in it was like a garden, right? With
Yes.
this guy. And she says, "Thank you," she told him. He looked up surprised. "For what?" "For letting me talk and listening without judging. I don't get that very often." And in this moment, I just sort of saw her vulnerability and I saw the potential of that being manipulated. And I just, yeah, I saw something very dark there. And as we know, I was correct. Hizo was a bad guy. He was a spy for Palpatine, right?
Yes. Yeah. 100%.
All in all. And there was another moment that stuck out to me when she was given the task of teaching or watching after the young, very, very young Jedi. And I could just see like the potential for her life. I could see these paths. And I think this happened multiple times in the book where there were this paths that her life could take. And she seemingly, whether by her own choice or not, towards the end, certainly by her choice, chose the darker side. But this was a moment she was talking with a young girl, and the girl is, I believe they were going over like memorization, like mantra sort of things that the Jedi use, and
Mm-hmm.
I see giggles, but she says the wrong thing, like she says the total opposite thing, and she says, "I should do better to focus, shouldn't I?" The girl giggled politely and nodded. I just made a note that she could be such an amazing teacher. She has this unique experience of this isn't the perfect life for everyone, and I struggled in these ways, and I can see how my pain could educate me to be a better teacher for these young children. And it was just like a beautiful path that I saw for her in my head, and of course knew wouldn't happen. But it's just heartbreaking to see time and time again in the book. I have other more detailed notes and things, but I'll
Can
stop.
I
Well, that's
add to that?
yeah. Go
Mhm.
ahead, Hannah.
Yeah, I think you made a good point, Andy, about her potential. I think we actually saw it a few times in the book. I think we saw it
Mm-hmm.
with the children. Maybe not so much the artifacts. I don't really think she's ever into that. We saw her abilities to lead, which in her mind always went back to killing, but I think she had a lot of talents and potential for being a leader in conflict, right? And we need those as well, right? A commander, a strategist, those kinds. She was very decisive, impulsive, but
Mm-hmm.
also decisive. Um, and then we also saw her ability with her family when she met them, that she could have also chosen that life. And I totally understand this idea of that she had, which is like, no, I can't settle down just yet, right? I mean, she kind of went way off the deep end with that, but I understand that. But there was that appeal, and she could have settled with her family, and she even had kind of planned that, which also tells you that she had this interesting aspect where she was like in with the dark side and fully into being Inquisitor, but kind of was holding out, which is really unfortunate that she didn't make a different decision. But it also goes to show the consequences of that, because she also knew that if she chose to leave right then, they'd come after her and they'd destroy everything.
Yeah.
But so we saw a lot of potential that she had there, which I think made the whole story even more tragic when you see like
Yes.
what ends up
Mm-hmm.
happening to her and how she had changed. And so I think there's as much as I am fully on the side of there was a lot of mistakes by a lot of people, there were definitely downsides and things that the Jedi Order could have done better. I think probably most of us would agree that at the end of the day, she made a lot of these decisions and chose to interpret a lot of things that happened to her a certain way that brought her to a certain place, and it was very sad because um, she had so many things she could have done, such a unique background that she could have explored. So I think those opportunities were well displayed to really help us to maybe not mourn, depends on how you felt about the book, but really kind of be like, this was really unfortunate that this is where it went. So I think that was a good point that you made, Andy.
Yeah. I mean, I think where I come in at this point with everything that's been said, it's really hard to look at this book and what happens in any sort of binary fashion, right? the sort of desire that Michael, you sort of either have or idealize, or Taylor definitely has, of the kind of like good guy bad guy, dichotomy, and the sort of signpost morality type thing. It shows that the complexity of war, it's like everyone's a loser, right? Everyone's morals get changed or tattered, and it's really hard to stick to that, stick to your code. And you see that it reiterates that the Jedi are in a lot of ways creating an apparatus that is making a lot of Iskats, right? And now when you say that, you also have to say that that doesn't absolve them of the responsibility for their own choices. Certainly, when we talk about these off ramps, when every time she goes further down that path, some tragic things that happen to someone or forces that push you a certain way, you're still responsible for what it is that you eventually do and become. So there's no doubt about that. But looking at a cause and examining the cause so that you can prevent future cases like that is not like explanation is not justification, right? So Iskat did what she did, and it's inexcusable. That being said, we don't have to say the Jedi were better. She was misunderstood. Like the empathy that we give to 60 and 70-year-old Jedi masters and high councils and things like that, I'm a little surprised we can't extend to a confused, superpowered 13-year-old. Like it's frustrating that this child had to, and so many others, right? Nadar, Anakin to a great degree, all of the others that we see over and over and over throughout the Clone Wars, like they're forced. I mean, Ahsoka, we saw it in the Ahsoka show, just like this 13-year-old kid, 14, whatever, on a battlefield, right? Like I think seeing it in live action made that real for a lot of us, especially me, of like, wow, we've grown up with this, but that's so effed up. Like it's so weird that these kids are generals and in charge of life and death decisions. And how could the dark side not win? Like how could Sidious not win if those are the tools with which he's playing? Yeah, so that's the general reaction that I have at this point, is like I think everyone is right to a degree. Iskat, horrible decisions that she made, and the same with Tualon. But by the same token, yeah, my heart was breaking, and I was so frustrated the entire time, because it's like she's clearly not a collector. And if she has these sort of impulses and desires, it's not like she's torturing small animals for fun here. It's not like we have to do inpatient therapy for this child. You can surf that wave a lot more. And the irony of Mace Windu being the one saying that she has really gone off the rails, when Mace Windu is the creator of a pod and the one who has the purple lightsaber and like walks the line and everything. It just really, really pissed me off that he was high and mighty enough to be like, well, you've got to learn control, and like that sort of discussion coming from the ostensible leader, someone that could have course corrected this. Yeah, I definitely, again, it's not a justification for what she did, but definitely explanations. So that's what I had to say. So I guess we'll play tennis now. Whoever wants to go. Michael has some thoughts, please. Oh, Hannah too. And Andy.
Yeah.
I'll
Oh,
have thoughts.
the trifecta. Let's go. Let's go right to left. Michael was first. Go ahead.
Okay, I had several, but I'll keep it to one. Tualon, whatever we were saying his name. You, in your last comments there, you sort of compared him and said that he made poor decisions, and kind of like
don't spend.
So
that was a throwaway.
no, because I think that's an important point, because you were talking about how the Jedi Council and the Jedi sort of have engendered a culture that produces a bunch of Iskats, and the only other example I could think of was really Barriss, who was also.
I mean, there's a
similarly
lot of
disillusioned.
Inquisitors, you know.
There's a lot of Inquisitors, but this is the thing: is
Well, some were also
she,
completely tortured and
yeah, that's
twisted
what I was
up
gonna say. She was the
by
only
the
one
dark
that we'd
side.
heard of who joined of her own volition, who was that far gone before the Jedi even fell, to the point where she was willing to literally watch her fellow Jedi die, knowing what was going to happen. She's like, yeah, I will just let that happen to Tualan, who she arguably cared a lot for. I don't think that I blame Tualan at all, even though eventually he sort of seems to get his memories back and things, but he, at the same time, he's broken. He has been broken by the dark side forcibly, and he was not that kind of person. Even if he had questions, even if he, was a teenager and a Padawan and may had not have fully understood everything he was doing and not fully understood the Jedi and even been bought in all the way, he was trying his best, he was doing his best, and he was being rewarded for it, and how he was sort of treated and where he was progressing through the Jedi ranks. So his fall and everything that happened to him, I don't think is even remotely comparable to Iskat personally. I wouldn't blame him in any way for the kind of things that he ended up doing and happening, because he literally was brainwashed. He was tortured and brainwashed, and he was not the same person after that happened. I don't know.
But I mean, he still used the dark side to stay alive. When he had been shot. So, and again, but to your point, and to
just
not
laid over
disagree
and
with
died.
you,
Like, he got shot. He tried his best. Like, what's the alternative?
Well, no. Like that's where I'm going is, like, if it's a sliding scale, Iskat's probably an 8 on the, like, proximity to darkness, and Tualan might be 2 or 3, right? But at the end of the day, both of these teenagers are in war and surrounded by years and years of super
Jedi's
stressful
fault, though, either.
Is it not? Like, again, they put themselves in that position, like they, it's one of those
when
where
they signed up to be I mean, unless you're going to blame them for abducting children as a practice, which is probably more of a fair critique in general, but like, with their jobs
I'm
being
critiquing
the
the
guardians
Jedi
of peace
Order
and justice in the galaxy from birth, basically, like, it's not their fault that the war broke out necessarily, and they weren't certainly the ones coordinating all that. Literally, you got Palpatine playing both sides, being like, starting the war, hey, you guys should be generals, and oh, we're gonna fight you, and oh yeah, you should throw the kids in there too, and like, he's literally manipulating them on all ends. I don't know that I can blame the Jedi for that one. But like, even without the war, as we've seen in all other aspects of Star Wars, the Padawans have always been going with the Masters to some pretty brutal, dark stuff, even though we don't always talk about it. Like, they're in the combat situations always. I don't know,
they were knighted.
Not well, yeah.
What did you say, Ed?
Before that,
I was saying they were knighted during the.
They were
Clone Wars.
knighted because a tenth of all the Jedi were slaughtered, and they were low on numbers. And these kids all by all means went through the trials and had met all the requirements to become full-fledged Jedi. Like,
Michael,
they grew up.
I reiterate that explanation is not justification. I'm not saying what they did was stupid. I'm not saying I don't, like, understand why they did it or anything like that. I'm just saying that you can look at what happened through no fault of their own, potentially, but it still created these scenarios and turned on the pressure cooker. You've talked in other books about how you look on tragically when characters can't make a different decision, but it's a bad one, right? That's Sidious is the master of making the entire galaxy walk whistling to the guillotine, and that's what I'm getting at. But here the difference
is
the
we
only
off ramps for that, not the Jedi.
No, because you're still responsible for your actions. Like, if we're going to hold,
we were literally saying they had no other choice. That's kind of where I'm saying is we are saying they had absolutely no other choice. This was the best choice they were presented with all the choices that they had. This is the only option they had to continue protecting the galaxy from being overrun by the droid armies and literally, like, slaughtering people. If that was their only choice, was these kids who are basically part of the police force have to step up, and this small section we've decided these ones are ready. I don't see how you blame them at that point for it.
So again, I realize that you and I are going back and forth and leaving the other half of our panel.
This is good, guys. I just got to get popcorn. Keep going. This is great.
But again, I keep going back to what I'm saying here, which is, Like, they had other choices. I blame Sidious for creating the pressure cooker. I also blame them for acting in the way that they did. Yoda's been around 900 years. We're learning in the High Republic books that, that was kind of the blueprint for what happened in the Clone Wars. So it's like, maybe he should have said, I've seen this before, right? Yeah, 850,
My turn, guys.
900,
Come on.
whatever.
Come on, guys.
So,
Over here.
yeah.
Over here.
You just said it was good. You just told me to
Come
fight.
on, guys. I know. I'm
All right.
the,
Hannah's turn.
No, as I was reading through this book, I was thinking about the same thing, right? Because Michael and I have talked about this. I hear your thoughts on this, and not for the sake of like, I agree with everybody, but kind of like, this is so complex that I think the issue I might have here, and maybe this is also maybe what Michael is speaking to as well, is in the book, I think there's so much of her perspective. It's real. Everything is colored by what she is deciding, her thought process. I mean, I agree with you too. The whole Mace Windu scenes, I was just like, is he really this difficult? Like, I don't know, but
Right.
I'm no expert on Mace Windu. But there was just like, you would watch as she would present a scene and process it, and you're like, wow, that is so one-sided. And it got worse.
Correct.
And it got worse and it got worse. So what I would say to that is like, it's really hard to understand exactly what is really going on in the Jedi Temple from her perspective. But so that's where I would absolve I would be more biased in favor of the Jedi there, because she becomes so, to me, like just so against everything and so excusing all of her actions. But at the same time, I think there's plenty of evidence for in the movies and in the shows where Yoda's made comments and others have made comments about how like they weren't able to see Sidious. They weren't able to see some of these problems that were happening. Like the Force was clouded, as they had said. And so I think I also have problems with like taking kids away from their parents and being like, no attachments. And none of that makes any sense. And so like, I think there are definitely issues with the way that they go about with some of their training and some of the processes that, I don't know, how old is the Jedi Order? Like thousands of years old, that over time probably could have adapted. And Opus,
25,000.
Yeah.
25,000, there we go, right? That over time you're like, well, I guess some of this works, but then like maybe some of this doesn't. And I definitely think that, again, all from her perspective. And when you hear the few times, in my opinion, it seemed like the few times, having just read this recently, that other people got to explain to her their perspective, you were like, oh, there's a flash of light that you realize it's not all about the way that she is perceiving these things. Like, what's his name? Clefin Opus? Is that his name? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Who is rather like he was trying to get around her, but he would make comments and try to explain about her mom and about other things that had happened. There was a few other people, I don't remember their names now, who also tried to give her a different perspective as to like why they had chosen to approach her in a certain way. And I definitely think that if I had as many questions as she did and didn't receive so many answers, I would have a hard time too. But I also have, anyway, I just think that it was really hard to get. If you don't know a lot about the Jedi Order and you're not as well versed in it the way that I'm not as well versed in it, if you just read her perspective, I don't think it gives you at all a fair picture of what the Jedi Order looked like and the purposes behind what they were doing with the Padawans, because it was just so one-sided, I think. So my point with that is, I think through this book alone, it's actually hard to get a fair perspective on either side. Well, no, not on either side. More on the Jedi side is what my argument would be.
Go ahead, Andy.
Well, and I would say to that, I mean, there's so many like Jedi Masters and the people involved, at least in the beginning, that there were probably a lot of Padawans that got by with this like amazing life and this amazing master-apprentice relationship, and they got all the tools that they would have from a loving family. I think just because that happened doesn't mean that the other thing didn't happen. That Iskat had a really shitty experience and she didn't feel loved or comforted in the beginning with her master. She had this really crappy relationship with her. You could say like, well, we're looking through her lens and maybe we can't perfectly trust her lens, and that's true. But it's also, if as a child she didn't feel that support or comfort, then she didn't feel it. It doesn't matter if, someone tried, they obviously didn't succeed because she didn't get what she needed to get. At least that's how I saw it. And that, again, to reiterate what Ed said earlier, that doesn't excuse anything, any way that she hurt anyone down the line. It's just context, and context that I found to be really important when considering her as a character, especially in those early years. And we see that, I saw it again when, like we said earlier, she revisited her home world, and we see her surrounded by her own people. And there's a moment where she's actually embraced, and they hug her, and it's heartbreaking. And she says, I wrote down, no one shied away from her, no one flinched. This is like a direct line that was used again when she talks about Tualon, and that was just heartbreaking for me, because it's just so central to her point of view, is this, I would say, a terrible self-esteem, just thinking that, yeah, that no one would embrace her and love her like that. There's also a throwaway mention about droids caring for babies in the Jedi Temple. It's not talked about near enough for me to give like a full assessment on, but it does rub me the wrong way of like, how loved is a baby really gonna, like, what I mean, I don't know if
Yeah.
they have like tummy time at the
No
Jedi. They probably
attachment.
I've always wondered, why do all the Jedi babies not talk like C-3PO though? Like, if they're all being
Oh my
trained
gosh, that's
and
hilarious.
taught to speak
That's
by
a good point.
droids, why don't they all sound like droids? Like, why do we even have any spectrum of accent? Like, the only character we've ever heard of who
So
a Jedi
funny.
who's been justified in having another accent was Rael Averross, because he literally grew up on like with some backwoods people until he was old enough to like learn to speak. But all the other Jedi they should have like droid Coruscanti accents.
in Master and Apprentice, isn't there a character that was raised by
Yeah.
by C3POs basically, and he has a very he interacts with people in very strange ways. Yeah.
It's true.
That's
Yeah.
hilarious. Droids shouldn't be raising babies.
No,
Plot
it's
hole,
in
massive
the
plot hole in Star Wars.
The thing I keep coming back to, though, as relates to all this stuff, is this is a child, and we know that this might be a particularly problematic child. There's no avoiding that. No one's saying that that's not the case. And I think it's wild that we're holding her account of events to such high scrutiny, because it's like, yeah, these are adults. That's a kid. Like, yeah, it's frustrating. That's a kid. I mean, it's the same sort of idea of, okay, so she's predisposed to violence. Let's ride that wave. Let's validate that she's not alone here. Let's not be so judgmental. You, Michael, you mentioned Mace Windu, and you said, who better to lecture people on control? And it's like, because like that's why it's such a missed opportunity, because instead of being like, listen, I struggle with this too, and I have always been a blade, and I invented Vapod so that way I can, ride the wave instead of fighting it and letting it consume me and all this sort of stuff. He's like, no, figure it out, dingus. Like,
See, but
like
this
again,
is my thing.
that's the
Wait,
frustration.
I have a question on this.
Go ahead.
I have a
Please.
question on this. So, having only watched like the movies and the shows, I am curious, and tell me if I'm not remembering this correctly. As I was reading through this, I would agree with that and just be like, why is everyone giving her these super ridiculous answers? And this is another problem I had with just the writing of the book. So many things, thought processes, and conversations felt like they were repeated over and over and over. And my question is, have we seen such a heavy emphasis on like these repeated mantras over and over to any questions? Because Yoda would say things like that, but I feel like when you watch, and maybe it's just certain characters, but whenever you would watch Anakin interact with Ahsoka, and you would watch just all of these other characters in Rebels, yes, they would talk about things like you have to meditate and you have to be, the will of the Force, and like all of these things that she talked about. But it didn't feel like every conversation where someone was struggling with something that they just repeated the same 6 things over and over to them. So like, is this a writer's choice in order to make it really seem like she was just this one isolated person who dealt with this? Like, I just didn't feel like that was super realistic to to the world of Star Wars for almost every time she had questions. Like, am I
So
wrong? Is there others
so
where we've seen that?
this is the interesting thing about Star Wars, where our lens and what we've seen definitely taints what is established as the status quo. Qui-Gon, Anakin, Obi-Wan, like Obi-Wan is the closest to a standard form Jedi Master, and even he is a little off the beaten path. Dooku, Qui-Gon, Anakin especially, right? As their tutelage, their teaching styles are incredibly, like, they're all mavericks. And that's a point in Ahsoka, right? And so when we see in Rebels, to your point, Kanan is like, I'm a bad teacher. I'm terrible at this. When you see the more standard fare Jedi, the best example Michael put immediately in the chat, and I cracked up because that's where I was going, is Luminara Unduli, who is just the worst, and
Was that
everything
Barris's
that
master?
is correct.
Was that
Yeah.
Barris's master?
Yep.
Okay.
And Barris, you know,
Also
she's the
fine.
one, right? That's what I'm saying. Like, she's the one who was so rote
It's
on
all the
all these
master's
things.
fault. So bad.
Everything, but it's that archetype, right? It's like
Right, right,
everything is a trope, everything is a mantra. You know, there is no emotion, there is peace. You know, like that sort of idea. And yeah, when you try to cage a firecracker, it's going to shatter the glass, right? And that's what ends up happening here. And I mean, yes, Michael, you're right. They are, but I'm saying the ones that we see, these ones are the more extreme
Yeah.
version of
So
atypicality.
I totally agree, but I feel like even that is sort of boiling it down to like, oh, there's only two types of Jedi. There's like the Mavericks, and then there's the everyone else, and everyone else, like the good Jedi, are the mantra, you know, spewing, emotionless, stoic kind of things.
But
And
how do we know
I
that
don't
those
think,
are the like
well,
the normal
no, I
ones
think
either? If we've
to
only
what Hannah
seen
was
them.
saying, I do think this is, and we've sort of danced around this, but like Iskat, I don't think that this is indicative of all of the Jedi as a whole and a problem that every single Jedi had, and this is what would have happened every single time to this person who just came to the Jedi Order. This is what would have happened. I think this is a perfect storm of people who she was surrounded with, because also to keep in mind the characters that she's surrounded with in this book are not characters we'd ever really heard of before outside of Mace Windu. Like, the people that have the most influence over her are sort of this microcosm that haven't interacted with any of the other characters that we've seen in Star Wars and other cases. And so I think if she had a different master from the get-go with a different sort of network of other masters that were supporting her, it might have been very different. It just so happened that she ended up with several masters who all sort of gave her the same responses. Now, to the Mace Windu point, and I think it sort of trickles down to the others, I understand saying, like, in most cases, it would make more sense for somebody to say, well, I struggle with that too, and here's what I figured out, or I see myself in you, and so this is what I want to do. But I also want to say, from like giving that character the same benefit of the doubt, if we think that that's something reasonable Mace Windu would have done, why didn't he do it? Because unless we're just admitting and saying, well, Mace Windu is just a terrible Jedi Master and all these things, which I don't think that we necessarily would
He's
say.
not
I
the
mean,
best
again, don't
empath.
love his
I don't
personality.
like
Don't
him.
love his personality, but he did get to where he was, and he has had other people that he's trained. Like, he trained Depa Billaba, some other people, right? Like, he wasn't a total screw up, even if his personality is problematic. So my thought
Dude.
is, and
Oh, Michael,
but
you're
listen,
killing me.
listen.
Not everything is an extreme. I'm not saying he's a
No,
total
We're not
listen.
screw
calling
Let
him a
up.
me
screw
finish.
up. No.
Let me finish.
Saying he can't talk to kids.
Once again, I'm saying I don't particularly love him either, but my point is, I think he also might have seen this and said, no, that's not the solution. Like, he saw where she was going, and that wasn't the option or the idea. The best thing to do there wasn't to be like, you know, I had this problem too, and this is what I needed. Like, I'm thinking if somebody is in that situation who is so, we can all see he has such a direct relation to her and what she's going through, and that's the choice he made. That's what he said that he thought was the best thing to tell her right there, was not, oh, hey, you know, I went through the same thing and this is what helped me, but like, this is what you need to do, or you need to shape up. I'm not saying it was the right choice, but I'm saying maybe it was actually an intentional choice because he saw himself in her and he thought, you know what, this is what I wish somebody had told me when I was in this situation. This is what I think would have helped me. I'm going to try to do this for her. I'm not saying it's a good thing, but I'm saying if we're going to humanize every other aspect of it, we have to also look at that too.
What is
You guys are laughing at
happening?
me like
Yeah, I
Sure.
agree with you. Yeah,
Sure.
like
I didn't
like
think
look
we
at
disagreed to begin
Anakin.
with. I'm just
Look at
okay.
Anakin. It's
I'm
another.
lost.
It's a similar character that went through a similar arc, and Mace Windu treated him the exact same way. Anything that I say about what he could have done with Iskat is the same thing that I would say with I'm dead. Andy, did you post that?
Good job, Andy.
Andy posted in the Discord the TikTok of the hold on. She came down in a bubble, bro. Grow up. It's so
And her
funny.
sister was a witch, dude. Yeah, it's getting a little sweaty.
We're yelling. It's great. This is so much fun. Yeah, no, but the thing is, we're all right. Like, you know, you're saying Mace Windu has justifications for acting the way he does. Of course, like 100%. It's just like we're peeling back all these different onions and looking at different ways in which it could have been made better. And, you know, we talked about the typicality of Luminara and the sort of stoic masters versus the others. And I think, Hannah, the reason we know that is because more that Qui-Gon and all those were referred to as Mavericks. So the assumption is that the others are more, more stoic. They do more adhere to the code and this sort of thing. So it's not that we've seen hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of those, but it's more just like we're going to focus on the interesting ones. And so most of the other ones are more like Luminara. Probably not all to the degree that Luminara is Luminara, but yeah, like more or less. Yeah, like we don't know about the 180 some odd that died in Geonosis because a lot of them are just the same, you know? I mean, that's not true, but that's
average Jedi, you know.
Yeah, just the Hufflepuff Jedi.
Middling Padawans.
Yeah. Okay, so gosh, where do we go from here?
I have
Andy
a question. I have a go from here question.
All right.
Go ahead, Hannah.
Andy, do you have
if I can, if you wanted to go somewhere, that's fine.
Go ahead, Hannah.
Oh, me? Oh, okay. Sorry. Okay, so stepping back from all of this conversation, my big question is what is everyone's thoughts on what the point of the book was? Like, why did the author write this book? And was it just to show what it looked like, what the perspective of someone who totally went to the dark side that wasn't an Anakin or something like that, what it looked like? Was it the point was to show what it looked like to be an Inquisitor? Because it's an interesting progression for how this happened. And I asked that because the ending is really interesting with what happens, right? So she more or less basically completely turns. Then Tuwala, and I think I keep mispronouncing his name, and her have this very weird relationship going on, especially because considering how damaged they both are. Very strange relationship. Mm-hmm. And then at the end, they both die, right? And I think there's some really interesting points there about what happens when she fully embraces this dark side, right? Like there's really no happy ending here. But the thing that got me thinking was the dedication is really interesting at the end of the book. And how this where did my screen go? It just shrunk down. Anyway, because we have a picture. That's why. I was like, where did everybody go on the main screen? So what's interesting is that the dedication was to all of those who she'd said, I have to pull up the correct quote, but it was to those who had felt bullied and like misrepresented or like alone, I think is basically what she'd said. And I found that to be very interesting at the end of a book that I felt had a very tragic and dark ending, and the entire progression to me was very tragic and dark. And so I was like, is this trying to say we sympathize or empathize with all of those who have felt lost, and here's a story for you about that? Because it wasn't a great story. Or was it just like we see, like, I don't know. And so I was left at the very end really wondering, like, stepping back, what do you guys think the purpose of telling this story this way was?
Andy, do you have thoughts, or I'll go ahead?
And maybe you have quotes from the author too, which would be interesting.
Well, so the thought that I don't have those queued up, but she did talk at length about, she was interviewed by Alex from Star Wars Explained, and I was watching that, and paraphrasing as best I can, it's that same sort of idea of sometimes a tragedy can be used as a light, like a way out. Like an author can understand what it is that you go through, and all the time spent inside her head, it's like, I know what it's like to see the world the way that you do, right? Or something like that, something to that effect. And then the events of the story and all the stuff that we've been kind of jawing back and forth about, that serves to show, one, validate if you see commonality in your life, if you are one of the ones that are bullied, or even it's perceived that way, but then also for those who might be in that situation, instead of just thinking, oh, well, hey, they got to be better, well, now maybe you've read this, or someone like that, and you can more credibly put yourself in their shoes, and the frustration that Michael felt of, why didn't she just get this sort of thing. Well, it's like, now we know what someone like that might be feeling, so now we know how we can reach them. We can cut them off at those passes of, oh, well, if they think that we're being judgmental, we'll go out of our way to say, hey, I'm really not trying to judge you, I'm trying to relate to you on this, and like use that empathy to pull someone back. There's a preamble, or a trigger warning, for lack of a better word, in this book, talking about the character that that takes her life, and it was I think a powerful choice to include things like that, because that preamble from the author, I mean, that rocked me. Like, I thank all powers that be, I've never struggled with suicidal thoughts, right? That's not something that I've really waded into, but I know a lot of folks that are very near to me that have, and I've lost a few people, and so that sort of validation of, like, this character had everything. They had people that loved them, and they still couldn't see a way out from that sort of depression. I think for people that can't understand that, there are some things you can't sympathize, so you have to empathize, right? Like, you cannot know what it's like unless you've lived it, so you have to just believe them and take their conceptual understanding of things, and just treat it as fact. And I think if more Jedi had done that for Iskat, despite its logicality, or just like whatever veracity, it might have averted some of these tragedies. It does that approximate what you're going for? I mean, I think, like, that's the point, is like empathy, and finding trying to validate these experiences, and trying to give the rest of us a window into that sort of life and that sort of existence.
I feel like it might have been more powerful, and I see that there's nothing wrong with writing a story from the perspective of, I mean, there's so many books in the Star Wars universe, right? You can totally choose to write a story from the perspective of someone who becomes an Inquisitor or goes to the dark side. But I feel like a story like that, to your point, to really empathize with someone who's genuinely struggling, would be more powerful if there was hope at the end. And I think that was the thing that I struggled with at the end of this book, was to show, because there are people who struggle with this, and they have tragic endings. But for an audience who's reading this, I think it would have been powerful to see someone who, and it doesn't mean she had to go back to being a Jedi, or she had to be like, you know what, you're right, all those mantras were good, but I almost wish that after coming through this, we could have seen a redemption arc, right? Not just her and Wallen dying, right? Because the end of it was basically like they die, they're killed by Darth Vader, and it says there was her blade through his chest, his blade through one of her hearts. There was a rightness to it, a completed circle, and he was right. Iskat Akaris was finally free. And that's tragic to me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's complete. And then the next page is the dedication to all of those who have ever felt lost, alone, and unloved. And I see because I know the author she writes this too in the beginning, that she'd struggled with, I believe she'd struggled with suicidal thoughts as well. And so obviously she's here and she's overcome that. And so my point is not to say, like, I don't think there was a point here and this couldn't have reached an audience. I just wish that in order to show like the hope that can come from someone who has struggled this, it would have been powerful to see her really maybe come away from this and embrace who she was, whether that was going to her home planet or moving away from all of this and recognizing that like she didn't need to embrace this darkness or even the Jedi's mantras to be who she was and to be confident, or whatever she was going through. And it just was very tragic to me that that was the ending. And I was just a little bit put off by that connection to then this was like her freedom was death, and then also then this dedication to those who struggled, because so many people have struggled. And I think the hope of watching someone come out, like, wouldn't it have been powerful to see a Jedi who was just had gone through being let down by the Jedi and by the temple, and then either chose to not go to the dark side or not hurt other people, or had started doing that and then walked away, and then got that freedom in recognizing that it's not about these mantras and it's not about hurting people and power and items and stuff and a toxic relationship with the other person and this endless power for me to be free. Anyway, that's my soapbox.
And I think you make a beautiful point, and I love this character, and I want that for her too, like so badly. I was just waiting for the book to not end the way that I knew it was going to end, because her ending was already written in the comics, right? Um, but I do think, I mean, the realization that you came to, that like this is a shitty ending, this is a disappointing ending for her. Maybe someone reading could have that same feeling, even if they like you were saying, did struggle and were having the dark thoughts, or could relate to Iskat in any kind of way. Maybe that's the idea. They would feel the exact same way you did, of like, she's free when she died, that's it. And
Yeah.
maybe agree with you completely.
It,
That's just I
it's,
mean, just an idea.
that's a great way to put it, Andy, because I was trying to find a way to verbalize that, of like, sometimes it's because I'm predisposed to be like you guys. I like the happy ending. I really, I want the hope. I don't watch horror movies. I don't like things that are that aggressively dark to make you sit there in the puddle of blood and think about what's happened, right? But some of these things, sometimes, again, I go back to like seeing that person and seeing their existence and like understanding that, and again, validating. So someone that hasn't had these thoughts, someone that hasn't been in that spot, it's like, yeah, why would you do that? That's so crazy, right? But if you write a story to show that, hey, this is what could happen, and it is far from the optimal ending, and there were so many off ramps, and there are people that care, and that sort of thing, to sort of validate that, but also show the tragic nature of it and stare it in the face. I think it makes you sit with that uncomfortable feeling, and then you are motivated to make your life, or the lives that you can interact with, better. You can change your life and move on, so that way that book doesn't, the events in that book don't become. This is what the point of tragedy throughout literature so often, right? Now I know, Hannah, you're much more well read than I, but like, when I read Shakespeare and things like that, like, I get so angry at like Macbeth or any of these people. I'm like, oh my God, just come on, But at the end of it, the point of these tragedies is to be like, okay, well, there's lessons here, to not mimic their actions, right? And there's not much hope at the end of a Macbeth or any of those Shakespearean tragedies, either, I would say. Michael, you raised your hand. I don't know what you.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. So I'm listening to all this and I'm trying to think, because as much as you're right, I do, like, if I have a preference, I'm gonna read the story about the redemption stories. Like, I prefer the redemptive arc, the good guys win the end, whatever. But I totally understand every story can't be a redemption story. You can't have every story where the good guys win every single time or everything happens. We get bored with that. We watch Clone Wars and we're like, oh, and the good guys won again. Oh, and the characters didn't die because we knew they weren't going to die. So I think it's totally valid to have that. And outside of the dedication, I
Mm-hmm.
don't think I would actually have a problem with the way this story went. The fact that the characters die in the end, it was almost not a factor for me. I was kind of like, yeah, sure, whatever. They're bad guys, whatever. Of course they do. And they're Inquisitors. This is what happens to the Inquisitors. It kind of figured to me, but I think the hang up maybe Hannah is feeling is the connection with the cautionary tale as opposed to a redemptive story. Instead of an example of something where somebody got out of it, made bad decisions, but got out of it and started making good decisions. This is a cautionary tale. This is bad things that happen to people who make poor decisions. I think the problem is the framing of that with sort of trying to relate to people who have felt the way that she's felt, but then she makes all these decisions that she feels justified doing. And they've sort of subverted the moral throughout the whole story to the point where she thinks she's right. The way the story is written is very presented like she's in the right. She had no other choice. The Jedi did this to her. And we know through analysis and through talking about this and through, all these other examples that it's definitely not as black and white as the story makes it. But the way the story is written, it's kind of black and white. The way the story is written, the Jedi did this to her. She ended up the way that she did because of the Jedi, because of everything that they did to constrain her and hold her back. And then the very ending, when you're trying to say like we're writing this for people who feel the way that she does, and then they sort of validate that the way she feels free now is in death. And I see that particular comparison as being, I don't want to say dangerous, but I see where Hannah has the hang up, because I want to be like, this is a cautionary tale so that if you are feeling these ways, you are sort of off put by the decisions that she makes and like, wow, I feel that way, but I would never do that. Or, yeah, I can see her point, but that's extreme. I wouldn't do that. But in the same way, if you also buy into her reasoning and justification for everything she does, in the end, you might also agree that like, wow, that was the solution to her problems. And I'm not saying that I think anybody who is mentally healthy would come to that conclusion, but when you're writing to this audience and you're saying this is sort of the target and the dedication to these people, and then the way you write, you sort of only subtly make it seem like the things that she's doing are wrong, whereas she thinks she's right and everything she's doing is right, and then her ultimate solution is death. Like, that's what I'm not saying that I agree with it, because again, outside of the dedication, we see through this, but with
Yeah,
that in
yeah.
comparison, I'm like, this goes beyond a cautionary tale to more of a, I'm writing this to relate to you
Well,
and your situation. And it's like, is it a cautionary tale now?
but again, well, so the thing I would say, first of all, to validate what you're saying, yes, the dedication is odd, and it's something that while I'm able to justify or find a justification for, I feel like I'm doing the type of legwork that you were doing for some of the Jedi earlier on, and it's kind of like we're doing some legwork here, right? It's odd. I totally get that it raises these questions, and it is a little weird. But that being said, with Iskat at the end saying, "And she was free," like that's her thought. It's just as unreliable as all the other things throughout this entire book. That's not a third
No.
person omniscient sort of thing. It's like all these books, whenever the character dies, it's like, they that was their last thought, or they died thinking of this or whatever, like unless I'm mistaken, I took that as, that was her, and therefore just as dubious of a moral standing as the rest. um I don't know. This is just so awesome. I've thoroughly enjoyed this, and we could do another hour because it's just so much fun. I don't want to say that to cut anybody off. Is there anybody that has anything to say about this kerfuffle before I hit two other quick points before we get out of here? No, last call. Okay. Okay, so two things I wanted to point out, and like mini conversations before we wrap up, is there was a canonical kerfuffle. I use that word twice, but I think it works. Geonosis, they're dropped off with clones before the battle. That was very weird to me because, as I understood it, there's ways to make it work, maybe, but I'm fairly certain the Jedi went there without the clones, and then the clones showed up, and that is not at all the way this book reads and or is written. I thought it was just me that was feeling weird about that, but there's a there's a little continuity subsection on Wikipedia now too. So I think other folks have validated that take. Does anyone have anything to say about that? Any justification for it, or do we just note it and move on?
I thought so I'm actually confused a little bit in explaining it to Hannah, because Hannah asked some questions about that too, and she's like, I need to rewatch this because I don't remember there being that many Jedi. I don't remember them dying, all this kind of stuff. And
Yeah.
I was thinking like, well, this sort of, why did all the Jedi die if they had a full-fledged army with them now? And
Right,
that's not how
yeah.
this happened in the
Yeah.
rest of the Clone Wars. They didn't just die in masses, and it's not like the Geonosians really put up much of a fight. So like, maybe they just were really that not battle hardened or what, I don't know. But so
Well, the
so
Jedi
with that
did die. There
aside,
were like hundreds
yeah,
that went there, and a ton of
they
them died. But it was because there was no army, right?
well, I
Yeah,
thought they had
that's
already lost 1,000 of
that
them.
is
Right.
right.
That was the whole point. They lost a
Right,
lot.
right.
But then my next question, and I think I was talking with Hannah about this, but was why did they send so many Jedi in the first place to rescue Obi-Wan Kenobi?
Yeah, it was a lot of Jedi.
Like, I understand he said something about, he sort of indicated that they were building a droid army, and that's cool, but we've heard things like that before. That's not new. There was a droid army on Naboo. They sent 2 Jedi. And then those Jedi disappeared, and they didn't even say anything about it until they like showed
Yeah,
back
this
up,
is my
and they're like,
question.
yeah. So like,
and I
why?
mean,
I'm
Dooku is a
wondering
political
in
idealist,
canon
not a
now,
murderer.
right? But in canon now, I'm trying to think episode 2 wise. What was their reason and justification? Because so the battle could happen. Like, why did they send so many Jedi? I understand Yoda going, let me go check out this clone army, and then bringing it to come help. But like, why did they send 500 Jedi or however many they did? With those, they didn't even know Anakin and Padme were there. They didn't even know. Then they showed up with a lightsaber to give them.
Because
Like,
Obi-Wan is bae. We love him.
I mean,
Yeah.
I
Anything.
agree.
I love
but
him too, but no, I had the same
the more I
question. I
think
was
about
like,
this,
oh, that's a lot of people to rescue them. Sorry, go ahead.
no, you're good. It's the same thought.
Yeah, I was
Guys,
just like,
episode 2 came out and everybody dunked all over it for many of these reasons. I mean, the it's not strategically sound, and they did the Mission Impossible strategy of, we've got the set piece, now let's justify it. Like, I think that's fairly well established in and out of universe. So, like, yeah, 100% agree that was not smart, and it was bad. Yeah, they lost so many, and how could they not, right? That's
I mean, they could have
wild.
not, because apparently
Yeah.
they had an entire army to drop them in, and a strategic plan on taking out the turret cannons and like dropping them in everywhere. So they had high ground superiority. I don't understand how they all died. I don't get
So-
it.
well,
so
how
this-
many Jedi were there anyway? Do we know the full number of Jedi? Because in the book it was like 200 died there, and hundreds more died, and were super depleted. How many Jedi do we know
There were 10,000
would have been
Jedi.
there?
but
At
not
least
at
10.
the
Yeah, not at
bingo.
Geonosis.
So there were
Right.
10,000 Jedi at the time of the Clone Wars, give or take, and give or take 200. I think there is a number, 212 or something like that, 250
Something
somewhere,
about 200, yeah.
about 200, give or take, that took part in the battle. And then we know of a good handful that escaped out of the arena on those ships. But yeah, their numbers were heavily depleted. They lost a lot of folks.
Google
so-
says 212 Jedi fought, 179 fell. It was an 83% casualty rate.
I knew I heard
out of
212 somewhere,
10,000,
man.
That's not heavily depleted from 10,000, though.
Yeah, it's not.
I'm assuming
No,
the
but
war
then you have
after
the
is what-
war. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and then
so
Order
do we know how many
66
died in
and-
66? Because it keeps like when I was reading the book, it was just like funeral after funeral after funeral. So I was like, they must have lost hundreds even before Order 66, which was part of this whole plot, right? They would send them off and Jedi would die because the whole point was to get rid of the Jedi. But
So it's
anyway, it's a small detail.
We don't know the degree, but it was depleted, and then Order 66 took out all except
all.
a plurality, just a little bit, and then we've discussed that at length of what level of survival is believable, but yeah, so that's where that discussion comes in. But okay, so the last thing I want to talk about, it kind of relates to this, is the canon implications. We've had discussions before a lot about what authors are allowed to do and whether or not, their hands are tied about certain things. And it's like, God, I wish they would have done X, Y, or Z. And on that interview that I mentioned, Delilah Dawson, interviewed by Alex from Star Wars Explained, he kind of asked her some of these things, and I think she lets the cat out of the bag a little bit of like they really do watch a lot of this stuff. So I have I'm going to play the clips, but then it's kind of a dual thing I'm thinking here, which is first of all, I understand if you can't do some things, but then I wonder with this continuity question, like, how did that get in there? Is that intentional? Was that something that was made to happen? Like, if they're, having that much scrutiny over what characters are at certain meetings and all this sort of stuff, like, how did this happen? Like, that's a movie, So anyway, I'll play this and we can discuss a little bit.
Explore her relationship with like the seventh sister, the fifth brother, and kind of some of these Inquisitors we've known about for a while.
Yeah, that's one of those cases where I wanted to use everybody, and I could really only go deeper with the people that I was told that I could go deeper with. So if you're reading this and you're like, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you talk to that? Like, because they wouldn't let me. I did everything that they let me do. Like, I think I was told like you were allowed to mention fourth sister, so I was like, oh, here we go. I mentioned her, like, but that was it. So yeah, it was nice to get to play with seventh sister. I was very excited. I was like, I want to establish, like, Star Wars writers always want to, answer some great question in canon that people are really going to be hype about. So when I was like, oh, I'm gonna tell you why she gets to have those, why seventh sister has the droids.
Oh yeah.
So like that was very exciting. Where it felt like it feels like you're annexing a little piece of land. Like you're like, here's, I put a flag here. I got to do this.
Oh yeah, that worked.
So now I'm gonna move on and play a second part here,
where we got to hear it eventually, but you just made it to the point where I was like, I have to know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure this wasn't your choice either, but I was like, Tualon, still don't know his number, but that's okay.
Oh goodness, I screwed up the clip.
What's her number? I don't know why I got so invested with that. So thank you for finally getting to that, but you really dragged it out to the point where I was like getting anxiety about it.
That wasn't my choice. I would have loved to have told you every single thing about how one becomes an Inquisitor and gets a number and what the numbers mean, and I told you everything I was allowed to tell you.
Well, I figured it was a dramatic choice that worked, where we.
So that was very very interesting for me, because we've had that discussion at length so many times, and I was just fascinated by the degree to which the story group is involved, which makes sense. But then again, like if they're that arduous about some of these things, or stringent is a better word, then how do we have Geonosis problems? So does anyone have any thoughts about that? Raise your hand and I'll okay, yeah, Michael, go ahead.
I have a question about that last comment that she made when she was saying, I would have loved to have told you all about how, what the numbers mean and how you get them and all this, that, and the other, but I wasn't allowed to.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean that she wanted to write it and like create that, and she was told that she couldn't come up with that bit? Or does that mean that they have pre-established and like the story group already knows all this information? They've already decided how you get numbers and what the numbers mean, and they literally wouldn't let her say it.
Maybe it's in a different book or something like that.
Well, yeah, it's either something down the pipe or they're leaving it. Yeah.
So somebody actually had just recently asked me this question, somebody who didn't know a lot about Star Wars and was thinking, they were like, wow, George Lucas is such a visionary. I've started to hear and see so much more about Star Wars and like his world building. He just built such an incredible and vast and interesting world. And I was kind of like, I mean, kind of, like he did in the movies.
Just said
and such,
some stuff,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he definitely, but to be fair, his story wasn't exactly an original story. It was very, archetypical, if you want to say it that way. But like, it wasn't exactly an original way of making the story. He had definitely some original ideas and some things, and some of the stuff he wanted to do, he couldn't do, and somebody else, he was told he couldn't. But like, what we have as Star Wars today is not the product of one person's story and world building. It is very much a conglomeration. It's not like Lord of the Rings, where Tolkien came up with the universe first and then wrote a story in it. He did the world building separately. So, but this would be an example of that being the opposite, where they have already built the world building and they sort of give bits and pieces of it to authors and they say, hey, here's the thing. So this is how the numbering system and the Inquisitors work. You can write a story about it, but this is how it works. You need to write a story about it, kind of thing. Not like, hey, we have not yet established how the numbering system works. Why don't you write a story and decide how that's going to work, or we'll approve it, but like you're going to get to craft that. It's like, it sounds like they've already world built themselves how some of the, I don't know. I'd never thought that before, but the way she phrased that made me think maybe the story group has a lot more of this figured out than we have in canon established.
I think they have things blocked off. They have guardrails of like, we don't want this random novel to hamstring or to tie us down to this sort of methodology. When Dave Filoni randomly one day will decide it means your star sign and something else like that, right? Like they'll change it up. They do it all the time. Andy, you had your hand raised.
I was just gonna say, I think it comes down to money of like, we want to one day make content about this, and it's will make us more money than this book will. Whereas the
100% agree.
Geonosis, whereas the Battle Geonosis,
Right,
like they
you're
already
right.
made that content. They already made that content, so they're less sweaty about the details. Maybe that would be
Maybe,
my
yeah.
guess.
That checks out. Because I mean,
You're right.
like, like, okay, so Aftermath,
book.
right? Aftermath, there is a moment where the cool droid, Mr. Bones, is like kind of loosely wired and everything. At one point, he like has a moment where he has a fit and he says statement, and then he does like the HK-47 thing, right? And that was wild. That was massive. But like, all these authors that are super fans would love to put Revan this and Bane that and all these sort of things, but they're just not allowed because we know that someday they're going to attack all those stories. So I think you're exactly right, Andy.
To your second point, though, how if the story group has such a tight hold on all these stories, how do we end up with these? I don't want to say plot holes because that's dramatic, but like, how do we end up with these continuity fluctuations and errors? And the big one that I'm still personally stuck on is that Ahsoka book and the Tales of the Jedi, which I love the Tales of the Jedi episode, but like those two stories cannot coexist in canon. And so the point being like, is it just that the story group just decides, okay, this is canon now and this isn't? Whereas up until that point, I was not aware of a single, we go to this level of scrutiny because they do, right? Because we're sort of told that they hold these things so tightly. So of course we're doing the same. And then when there's an error, it's like, you're not even going to acknowledge it or make any statement.
No, Andy's
try
exactly
to
right here. It's like varying degrees of effort relative to fiscal impact, and the canon I think reflects it. Like that book, it was great. You got a lot of backstory, but we want to do this cool TV show, and that's going to take precedence. And Dave Filoni's hands are over it, and that's what's going to happen. And that's kind of what. As relates to why we don't see Bane, why we didn't see Thrawn before he was brought into Rebels, like all this stuff is there. They want to do it. They're going to be very cautious of that. They're not going to be as cautious about every single plot detail to the degree that we are. And again, we should acknowledge we're grilling them, but like they probably are to an insane degree, but they're also human and this stuff is hard. And, so I'll give them that. I've never written a world and, all this sort of stuff. So fair enough. But yeah.
But like if they're getting into the nitty gritty so much to where they're like, you're not even allowed to mention this character, or you can mention this character because obviously they're doing the work to know which characters are around, what they're doing, who she would have interacted with. And like the dropping in before clones versus after clones thing is kind of rough. That's like a pretty major change to be making.
Yeah, it was a big one.
Yeah. But they already made that movie, so
Why? Yeah, I mean, saying Disney can't go back and change things?
It's weird. That one is very weird, and we're all in agreement that I don't know what the heck anything means anymore. So we'll wait and see what they say about that, because that one is pretty odd. And if I ever get the chance to sit in front of Delilah Dawson, I would love to to do that. I think I still have Alex's Patreon too, so I'll probably hit him up and ask him to ask her. I don't know. We'll see. But at any rate, this has been a hoot and a half. Anybody final thoughts We'll go around the table here, and then we'll get the heck out of here. I'll start right to left this time. Andy, you can have some time to get some final thoughts together. Michael, you first.
Like I said at the beginning, I think talking about this more, as much as I would argue this is probably a skippable book, it is for certain people. It is for certain audiences. Certain people are going to be more drawn to this kind of story than others, and it's nothing if not thought provoking. Obviously,
hands down, the most fun, interesting conversation I think we've had on here. Maybe outside of our ranking, that was a lot of fun too. But this was good, man. It was I love it, Andy, when you're like, she came down in a bubble, dog. I swear to God. So my fiance Lauren has a shirt that it's stylized. It's like, her sister was a witch, bro. That's awesome. I love that so much. All right,
Hannah and I over here are very confused because I don't think either of us get the reference.
We're just laughing along with you.
You guys are gonna lose your mind. I'm gonna post that.
Vines don't even exist anymore.
I know, that's so old.
I will post it in the Discord, or Andy might be now. I don't know. We'll figure it out, but you will see it and you will die. It's great. It's amazing.
We still appreciated the cut anyway, though. It was great.
You'll see how good my impression was. Yeah. Right. All right. All right.
Always love a good
Hannah,
impression.
Go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it's funny. The last time, or has it been maybe 2 times you did this, I usually will have a whole closing thought. And I was like, this is what I think, this is what I didn't get to mention. But I think we did a good job covering a lot of the most important points. And I think, yay!
Hold on, I've got a button here. Let's see. Yeah.
Good job, Ed. Good job,
Yay!
team. So I don't have too many additional closing thoughts. That wouldn't just be repeating what I'd said. I think Michael did a good job in saying that it's thought-provoking. It's dark. I agree that it's definitely, I don't see it as having any super important content that you couldn't skip. I probably, on one hand, need to probably read it again because I kind of rushed through it in order to be done in time, but also
Fair
kind
enough.
of don't want to read it again at the same time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, if someone's on the fence and isn't, I don't know.
Yeah, it's hard
conflicted
to
feelings about
talk
this
them
one.
off of it, right? Yeah, I get you. It didn't seem to hit out of the park for either of you guys, but I love that you read it, and I love that we got to have such an awesome discussion here. This was so much fun, seriously. Andy, what are your final thoughts about this one?
I loved it, and I do think it is sad and it is tragic, and it could have a more hopeful and happy ending, but I love it for what it is. I have this conversation with my mom where she's like, I don't want to watch a movie that makes me cry. I do. I want to feel things. I want it to make me sad and break my heart, and go for it. If you like that too, then you'll probably like this book.
Yeah, 100%. I will freely admit that I am more on the Hannah and Michael side of appreciation of things that make me cry. Like, I don't usually go for overly dark things. Like season 5 of Game of Thrones was very hard for me to get through, for the one of you who might have watched that show. Oh, no. All right. For the internet, y'all are with me. God, I feel weird about normal takes on this show sometimes. But anyway.
It's not a take.
Anyway, yeah, this one was, it was fun for me to get a little outside of my comfort zone and read this sort of thing. There was enough characterization and enough of the events that sort of held my hand through it, and I really enjoyed. So yeah, I really had a good time with this one, and I can't wait to decide what we're going to review next and have a lot more fun reviewing more books on freaking program. Hey, thanks for hanging out, folks. Like I said, hoot and a half. Hoot and a freaking half. That was a lot of fun. Good discussion, lots of back and forth there. So if you want to join in and tell us who was right, who was wrong, and how we all actually are, leave the comment below. Drop a like, subscribe, send it to your mom. It'd be great. She hasn't heard from you lately. hit her up. Send her this video. We appreciate you. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time on Program.